All right, thank you. I'll say a few words and then I'll go into the slides. Thank you very much, Katya. What I'm going to do is, it is a book launch, so I'm going to explain why I came to write this book, what motivated me to write it. It's a popular book, although I hope it's of still some benefit to specialists. So I'm going to say a little bit about that as well, what some of the sort of practical issues are in writing a book that's for a non-specialist audience and an English-speaking audience. And then I'm going to explore 4 themes that run through the book and say a bit about each of them. As Katya said, I consider myself to be an 18th, early 19th century specialist. I wrote my thesis on the period of Catherine the Great, but then I went on to write a biography of Alexander I. And the interest there was very much contrast, if you like, between Russia's international position and stagnation domestically. So there was that sort of interest. I then wrote a social history of Russia from 1650 to 1825. And after that, I went in a completely different direction, and I wrote a diplomatic history of a man called Charles Whitworth, who was the envoy, later ambassador to Russia during the reign of Peter the Great. He was the right man at the right time, and he witnessed Russia's rise to power. And then I brought those themes together, I think, in the book that Katya mentioned, which is really a study of war and society in the period 1762 to 1825. So really, those are rather scholarly books. Alexander I, I think, was also available to a non-scholarly audience, but the other ones are very detailed, very heavily footnoted. So there was a question really about why I moved from that to write a more general history. And the first one was the History of Siberia, which came out in 2014. And I think there was an element of chance to it, as so often is with publications. Yale pushed me to write something like that. And I thought, well, why not? Actually, why not write something like that? Writing a general book gives you the opportunity to really explore the areas you want to explore, cover the themes you want to cover. But I also thought that after then 25 years of teaching Russian history, it was perhaps about time I used some of my knowledge to write something more general. When I wrote the Siberia book, I was also the pro-rector of the London School of Economics. It was very good to have somewhere to escape to from that, to keep my mind active. But it also wasn't practical to think of going and working somewhere in Russia for months at a time. So there were practical elements as well. And the final thing about writing a popular book is that actually it was great fun. And I do think that in the last couple of decades, certainly in British academic life, and I think in other academic life as well, the fun element has almost disappeared from academic life as we all hit standards and 5-year plans and all the rest of it. But I was able to travel to Siberia, went to a lot of towns otherwise I never would have visited. And the background to this is that when I was a postgraduate student in Russia, you could only work in Leningrad or Moscow. I was in Leningrad. And it was just great fun to do that, to meet people, to use some archives. So I went from there to then thinking about writing another non-academic, for a book aimed at both a scholarly and a non-scholarly audience, if you like. And I'm going to go into my slides now, I hope. I'll start at the top, if I can, move up. Yeah. Why write a history of something like the Volga? Why do it at all? Why write it for an audience where I know I've got to explain Russian terminology, explain what a serf is, and also having the constraints of having to write to a certain word length. In fact, Yale were very generous about that. They allowed me to write about 2/3 more than the word length that they gave me. But, I can't write, an encyclopedia. Why do it at all? Well, I suppose the most obvious, simple answer is that the Volga is one of the great rivers of the world. It's there with the Nile, with the Mississippi, to write, one of the great about rivers of the world. But it also allowed me, I think, to explore some of the aspects of Russian history which have always interested me. In particular, what happens, how do you govern a multi-ethnic empire, and how does the Russian state evolve on the borderlands and in the regions in order to be able to do this? So I think that was my starting point. And I don't really have to show this particular group where the Volga is, but certainly writing for a non-specialist author, it was very important to get permission from Yale to have quite a few maps. The type of person I'm writing for in Britain will have heard of the Volga. I'm writing for an intelligent non-specialist audience, but they won't quite know where it was. And if I say Kazan or Astrakhan, the first thought is that that's probably somewhere in Asia. So I have to show to an English audience, an English-speaking audience, where the Volga is, where it starts up here to the west of Tver. And I did go to the source of the Volga. One of my friends, Viktor Kulikov in Yaroslav, took us to the source of the Volga, and then following through what we would call the heartland of Russia, through to Nizhny Novgorod, where I make a particular emphasis about the fair, through to Kazan, and then down through to Astrakhan. Well, I had to be familiar with the river as well as my readers. So the first thing I did, having stepped down as head of department from the LSE, was to go on a river cruise up the Volga so that I could see what it was like from Astrakhan up to Nizhny Novgorod. And as well as being enormously enjoyable, it did show me some things which I think then come out in the course of the book. One of the things it revealed was the difference between the two banks of the river, particularly if I'm talking about the lower Volga from sort of Kazan south to Astrakhan. Rivers divide as well as unite. And I think that's one theme that constantly I come back to in the book. Which side of the river you were on mattered enormously. The river is so wide, at least south of sort of Yaroslav, Kostroma, that you can only really build on one side of the river. German settlers who came to the Volga, particularly around Saratov area in the 1760s, felt very aggrieved if they were on the eastern side, the left bank of the river, because they felt the land was far better than what they referred to as the mountain side. Partly that was because they were exposed to attacks by Kalmuks, partly because the land was poorer, or perceived to be poorer on the eastern side. And I think that is something that has come through in the book. Tamila Lankina, who's here, introduced me to the contemporary Tatar writer, Guzel Yakina. And she wrote, well, several books, but she wrote a book called My Children, Dieti Mai, which is about German settlers on the Volga. And it starts with this passage put into the mouth, really, of a German settler on the eastern side of the Volga. And he says, it's the beginning of the book, it's my translation, he said, the Volga divided the world in two. The left eastern bank was low and yellow and flat, stretching out into the steppe, from beyond which the sun rose every morning. The earth here was bitter to taste and dug up by gophers. The grass was dense and high, but the trees were stunted and sparse. The fields disappeared beyond the horizon, multicolored like a Bashkir's blanket. The villages clung along the water's edge. The wind blew hot and spicy from the steppe, from the Turkmen desert and the salty Caspian. What it was like on the other bank, no one knew. A cold wind always blew from the right bank, from over the mountain, from the distant North Sea. And I think that was something which I simply had to see to appreciate. I had to appreciate the communications as well. This is the presidential bridge in Ulyanovsk, Simbirsk, taken on a frosty afternoon in November. And of course,
I'm sorry, terribly sorry for the interruption. Could you enlarge the presentation so we can see the screen fully? If you go down, there's a special icon. No, just a little to the right. You were right. Yeah, so it's no, I don't think so. So if you go to the other side.
I've lost it now. I've lost the pictures. Hang on.
Oh, really?
Hang on. Zoom slideshow. Is that's better?
Yeah, that's better.
So
Thank you.
So if I'm moving them down, I move it down. Okay. All right. No, that's much better. Okay.
Here we go. Thank you so much. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I mean, to me, of course, this is from Simbirsk, Ulyanovsk. So, you know, it's not at the widest point of the river. Of course, you can't have a bridge across the widest point of the river. But coming from a country where every town has got lots of bridges across rivers, as we went up the Volga, I kept asking where the bridges were. This is a road bridge. It's not a rail bridge, but building road bridges, building rail bridges unites across the Volga, but it can also divide the Volga if the railway lines go up the sides rather than crossing. And actually from Ulyanovsk, I got the train from Ulyanovsk to Kazan, and the crossing was at Svyazh, where Ivan the Terrible had his troops to attack Kazan. It's north of Kazan. It's the first crossing. And I think without seeing those difficulties of communication, how important they could be, it would have been very difficult to have written this book. The other thing that struck me on my tour up the Volga was simply the ethnic diversity. And of course, I'm writing for an English audience, many of whom probably think that the whole of Russia is full of Russians, and that anyone who is not ethnically Russian lives in what had been former non-Russian Soviet republics. But Astrakhan struck me, Kazan struck me, Samara, Saratov, of course, are much more Russian towns, but Saratov was the administrative center for the Volga Germans. And then progressing upwards, Kazan was the capital of Tatarstan, Cheboksary, capital of the Chuvash Republic. So that element too, I think if I hadn't seen it, I perhaps would not have concentrated on that so much. And now to come to the book, but just 1 or 2 points before I do about writing a book like this and some of the problems or issues, if you like, that it exposes. One obvious one is that this is a chronology. I take it from the Khazars in the 17th century through to the present day. I think the last reference I had in it was to a Russian TV program in 2019. And it does mean stepping out of your comfort zone if you do that. And I'm very grateful to many friends, some of whom are here, Tamila I've mentioned, Margot Light, Shailev and Peter Waldron, for sort of putting me right on some aspects which are outside my comfort zone. But certainly for the first 2 chapters, the medieval period from the 7th century, I can never present myself as a specialist on Vulgar fortifications or on hoards of coins, and those had to be introductory chapters. In fact, that the structure of the book lent itself to that. There's also, when you write something up to the present day, you're always liable to be caught out. There's a gap between submitting the text and publication. And it sounds obscene to say that you spend the next year, or I think it was 15 months in my case, hoping that a catastrophe doesn't take place because it's going to affect the wording of chapter 17, but you do become slightly obsessed with what's happening. Well, in the end, there was nothing that happened that particularly affected the Volga. There was no appalling ecological disaster or a dam bursting or something like that. But what happened, of course, was the pandemic. Now, in terms of this book, it was slightly ironic in a way, because I have a chapter in the book where I talk about disease on the Volga. It's 18th, 19th century. I talk about plague coming up the Volga. I then talk about cholera in the Volga. And then I talk about science on the Volga, about the medical science that deals with disease, and then indeed about aspects of the southern part of the Volga, where there was a fascination with the flora and the fauna, and a belief that this might help Russia economically. When I wrote that chapter initially, I struggled initially to even find material for it. I did find enough material, but I thought I'd been rather imaginative, even quite bold, if you like, in having a chapter like that. Whereas now I think if I hadn't got that chapter, people would find it fairly astonishing. So I think that's the one thing that sort of happened in a way that I couldn't anticipate. I don't know that I would have written that chapter any differently, but quite a lot of the chapter is about the government trying to control a situation which is out of control, and the relationship between the centre and the particular towns on the Volga which are so badly affected. More fundamental, I think, in writing a book like this, that there has to be a question of balance. The Volga is a long river, and I think it's probably fair to say that the book does concentrate more on the middle and the lower Volga, simply because the type of themes that I'm looking at, whether it's government control, whether it's extension on the frontiers, whether it's multi-ethnicity, tend to be more prominent, more important, if you like, in the south. I tried to balance it. I tried in my introductory chapter to balance looking at the South, Kazan, Volga states, and then the Kazan and Astrakhan Khanate. I tried to balance that out with Tver, the Principality of Tver, and the conflict between Moscow and Tver. I tried to balance it out in the Second World War by not only looking at Stalingrad, which is obviously a thing to look at, but looking at Rzhev as well in the north. But although in some aspects it's easy to include the whole of the river, it's not always possible to have a complete balance. And then the final problem in a way was knowing where the river ended. That might seem obvious, but it's not obvious. It's obvious when you're writing about trade, even though, of course, many of the goods don't originate in the Volga. It's obvious when you're writing about trade up and down the Volga. It's fairly obvious when I'm writing about violence, about pirates, about Pugachev on the Volga, conflicts, the role of the Volga in the Civil War, the role of the Volga in the Second World War. It's fairly obvious when I'm writing about ecology. It's fairly straightforward when I'm writing about towns, because the Volga towns that I write about are on the Volga, and they're there because of the Volga, either because of its strategic position or its economic position, almost always at the confluence of the Volga and another river, sometimes evolving for that reason, other times deliberately put there by the Russian state as a fort on the Volga as part of their chains of forts. But it's not so obvious when I'm writing about peasants. There are villages on the Volga, of course, but in the lower and middle Volga, it's rare to have villages right on the banks because they flood. So the obvious place to have the villages away from the banks, even if they use the Volga. And I think I questioned myself at times how far away I was moving from the Volga when I was talking about peasant life in the 18th century, when I was talking about settlement of the Volga, or when I was talking about aspects like collectivization, whether this was keeping the river always at the fore. So I think that was also an issue when you write a book about a river. It's almost inevitable in a way. Well, in a way, that's enough on the background. What is the book about? It covers a long period. The first two chapters were introductory. The greatest weight of the book was on the Imperial Period. It's a mixture of chronology and themes. So the Imperial Period I divided into two broad themes, the first of which was state control of the Volga, in which I go from the time of Ivan the Terrible from the mid-16th century through initial control of the Volga, then the control of violence on the Volga, curbing Cossack revolts, pirates, and then I talk about other forms of state control of the frontier, disease and science, and policies of conversion on the frontier. The second section, Imperial section, is more about life and identity on the river, a Volga town, a Volga village, life on the river, Russian identity in terms of literature and art of the Volga, non-Russian identity, Tatar identity, and other groups as they take off in the later 19th century. As I do that, I then move into the 20th century, some of which has to be chronological: war, civil war, 1930s, Second World War. But again, it's not a full chronological study. I cover the relationship between the center and non-Russian groups from 1917, and also ecological questions. There are four main themes that run through the book, which I'll now say something about. The four of them are the Volga and its importance in trade and commerce. The second one is the Volga as a meeting place of different peoples, ethnicities, religions, and cultures. The third one is state building and conflict, both in the Imperial period and Soviet period. And then the final one is the evolution of a Russian and non-Russian sort of culture and identity. Well, if I start with trade, it seems obvious, I guess, that it is the one, it's the most obvious thing to start with. I've just included this picture here, really for an English-speaking audience when talking about trade, because it's easy for me to talk about goods going up and down the river and forgetting to mention that for up to 5 months of the year, the river could be frozen. And in fact, if you look up the Volga on Wikipedia, I think every image that you get is of a beautiful blue river with beautiful blue skies. So it was important to assert that. Volga itself is an immensely important site, both as an archaeological site of Volga and in terms of Tatar identity. But this was also to show the river it's in a different context. I felt I ought to visit the Volga at different times of the year. I've been there 4 times in 4 different months. This is a March picture, March 2019, after a particularly snowy winter. So I look at trade. It's obvious in a way the Kazan, Volga states, if you can call them states, were formed because of trade on the Volga. Trade brought people down the Volga, Vikings down the Volga. Trade remains important throughout the period. Towns are founded because of trade. I look at types of trade, mainly south to north, mainly east to west. So that goods, of course, are not originating just on the Volga, but they're coming across the Caspian. They're coming from China, either to Astrakhan or to various points like Samara on the Volga. I look at the way in which the river was made into a trading route with the connections of canals at the top so that it linked through to Moscow and St. Petersburg, particularly important for the grain trade. And I look at multi-ethnic trading cities, of which Astrakhan, probably the most diverse, and even had a small British presence there in the 17th century. But certainly 17th, 18th century, the groups Armenians, Indians, Persians, and Russians, of course, in Astrakhan. Throughout the book, I try to liven it up, if you like, for an English audience by using English travel accounts and British travel accounts. And they're particularly fascinated by trade and by multi-ethnic cities. So just to give one example of this, one quote on this, this is a description of the fair at Nizhny Novgorod in the 19th century, and the just total sort of diversity of peoples who could be met there. This particular one is by Robert Bremner. He refers to costumes and faces more varied and more strange, never before assembled in so small a compass. White-faced, flat-nosed merchants from Archangel with his furs, followed by a bronze long-eared Chinese who has got rid of his tea. Next came a pair of Tartars from the 5 Mountains, followed by a youth whose regular features speak of Circassian blood. Cossacks who have brought hides from the Ukraine. Those who follow by their flowing robes and dark hair must be from Persia. To them the Russians owe their perfume. The wild-looking Bashkir from the Ural, glancing in another direction. Yonder Greek from Moldavia with a rosary in his fingers is in a treaty with a Kalmuk as wild as the horses he was bred amongst. Nogais are mingling with Circassians, and drapers from Persia are bargaining with shawls of Kashmir with a member of some Asiatic tribe of unpronounceable name. Very British. Jews from Brody are settling accounts with Turks from Trebizond, cotton merchants from Manchester, jewelers from Augsburg, watchmakers from Neufchâtel, wine merchants from Frankfurt, leech buyers from Hamburg, grocers from Königsberg, amber dealers from Memel, pipe makers from Dresden, furriers from Warsaw. It was the thing that really struck English travellers in the 19th century. I mean, it's a fair, and one can discuss whether a fair is a sign of modernization or not, but it was clearly the whole density of it was something that struck everybody who went there. In the later period, I look at railways. As I said earlier, railways divide as well as unite. Railways distort and change the importance of various towns. Tsaritsyn, I think, probably being the key one which benefited from both railways which went to Rostov in the Black Sea and railways that went to the north. And then a follow through of I'm looking at the river, looking at points of ecology and pollution through to the present day. I look at life on the river. I guess that's the most obvious chapter in some ways to look at, oops, wrong one, life on the river. I want to move down. I'm just moving up here for life on the river. I mean, here is the Volga boatman, of course. Here's the Repin's Volga boatman. I suppose the most famous painting of the Volga. I have to say that one of the things that struck me on my trip up the Volga was how rarely there's a towpath on the side of the river. There may well have been at the point of the river, the big bend of the river where Repin did this painting before the river bends to Samara, but for the most part there isn't, certainly in the lower and middle Volga, and that most of this pulling off must have been pulling off sandbanks rather than pulling off the river. And if you can see, I think I've got this painting so that so that I can see the top of the mast of the ship. You will see that quite bizarrely, the rope is tied to the upper top of the mast. So were this to be pulled along, the mast would snap very easily in two, should be in a windlass on the deck. But nevertheless, you know, this is the famous painting. I also think that in the original as well, instead of having a steamship on the opposite bank, there were picnickers on the opposite bank. And I think maybe that too perhaps would have indicated something about the contrast between the people pulling the ship and tourism. But I do look on the life of the river, which of course has been written about extensively in Russia. So I look at the river, I look at trade on the river. The second main issue which I look at is meeting of different people of different ethnicities on the river. I have a picture here of the Tatar Quarter in Kazan. To me, I think the multi-ethnic element on the river is not actually unique to Astrakhan and Kazan. You could also see it certainly with old believers in Nizhny Novgorod and Gorodets, and indeed with other non-ethnic groups in other towns. Germans I came across in Tver, as well as Volga Germans. But to me, it's the most interesting element, I think, of the book. And also, I say I'm also trying to write for a non-specialist. It's the area of the book where I most used archival sources, mostly from Kazan, but also I was able to access sources from Samara and from Yaroslav. And particularly, I mean, this isn't a serious archival study. I've not spent 6 months in the archive, but I did look at quite a lot of papers on particular issues with ethnic groups, not just Muslims, but also looking at Roma, looking at Jews, looking at old believers, and in the later period, looking at Baptists as well. So to me, that way in which that worked out in practice was something that I think probably was, to me, the most key element of the book. I'm looking at it in terms of state policy, state control. Then I'm looking at various periods of conversion, really from the point at which the Russian state moved into the Volga in the second half of the 16th century after the conquest of Kazan and Astrakhan through to the 19th century. It's always easier, as it was in other parts of Russia, as it was in Siberia, always easier to convert pagans than it was to convert people with animistic beliefs than it was to convert Muslims, or for that matter, to convert Buddhists. But as the centuries progress, it's not a straightforward policy. There are ebbs and flows in the way in which the state tries to convert people and the intensity of it throughout the 18th and the 19th century, and then a reaction against it in the late 19th century from Muslims who'd been converted to Orthodoxy. So that I outline in the book. To me, it's an extraordinary example of the way in which the Russian state operates. There's quite an enormous bureaucracy at work for a start, sometimes just for one family of Muslims who might have reconverted, former Muslims of Tatars who had been converted to Orthodoxy, reconvert to Islam. The amount of paperwork that generates in the 19th century is really quite extraordinary. The amount of investigation, the amount of officials involved, right up to the governor's office in dealing with one case. But it also illustrates, as well as the sort of bureaucratic workings of the imperial state, it illustrates the concerns, the suspicion, the potential threat or perceived threat that could be there to Russian control of an ethnically mixed area. So I think that too is very revealing. When I look at this, I'm not just looking at conflict, I'm looking also at issues that come about in matters such as education. What type of schools are allowed? What type of schools are closed down? What the teaching of schools is, how much intervention in the government takes place in that as well. Now, this is a book for a non-specialist audience. I think I tried to make the book sustainable in a way, to keep the readers interested. You have to tell stories. And one of the advantages of going to the archives and looking at particular issues like this is that the human story can be illustrated in a way that statistics and numbers about the numbers of non-Russians in particular regions doesn't really catch the imagination in the same way. So I'm just going to give just a couple of very brief examples of things I found in the Kazan archives that talk about these sort of aspects. This is in the 1870s. It's a report that comes through to the governor's office from a teacher in a school, which was a school for converted Tartars who converted to Russian Orthodoxy. And he was complaining about what he referred to as the tyranny that was inflicted on his pupils as they walked to school, how Muslims threw stones at them, but also how they tried to pull them out from the street and persuade them and talk to them, and to persuade them to then also talk to their own parents and bring them back to Islam. And then he gives an example of a 14-year-old boy whose relatives almost sort of captured him and then sort of beat him up, trying to persuade him to go back home and to persuade his parents to convert back to Islam. So that sort of human story, I think, and the amount of paperwork that it generates is the sort of thing that I write about. And to give it a different type of an example, this is late 19th century. It's a report of a religious procession by Orthodox Chuvash peasants in Simbirsk province in Ulyanovsk, who went through a Muslim village as they were in their religious procession. And then there was a question of how this is handled. Tartars blocked the road. They threw stones. They disrupted the procession. The police had to intervene and accompany the procession. But in the end, some sort of modus vivendi was found. The peasants did it in silence. They covered the cross. There's something, a bit Belfast element here, I think, of marching through territories which are clearly of a different faith, wanting to assert your right to do so, but in the end, a degree of compromise. And I think those sorts of stories that I can bring out about conversions, about Islam, about the relationship between Muslims and Orthodoxy, and indeed the relations between converted Tartars and non-converted Tartars, is something that reveals a great deal about the type of tensions that existed, the social conflicts that existed on a low level, on a human level, and the actions that the state took against them. Now, when I continue with that theme, I also look at the relationship between Russians and non-Russians in towns in the Volga and in the countryside as well. In particular, in towns, again, I got archival materials there about how courts function, for example, what you do when you have a Russian in conflict with a Tartar, or an Armenian in a conflict with a Persian in Astrakhan. Which court do you have to hold that case in? What sort of conflicts? Sort of the normal sort of human problems, if you like, being played out on a local stage when you have a multi-ethnic population. It's relatively easy, I think, to look at the way in towns in which people interacted with each other. There were separate quarters, not just in Kazan. This is the Tartar quarter in Kazan, now a sort of attraction for tourists, but also in other towns as well, both including towns in what is now Tatarstan and further south as well. Clearly there were quarters in Astrakhan, but even in other towns, there were areas of all believers, Jews, where there could be a distinct area, areas where they were separate, in other words, separate in their festivals, separate perhaps in their dress, separate perhaps in their furnishings, but also areas where they came into contact with each other, whether it was legally, economically, in terms of institutions, or simply in sharing certain events and pastimes. I have a certain amount there on what do you do at Easter. It's easy enough if you're Russian, but if you're a Tartar, you perhaps want to celebrate it, you can link it with a Muslim festival. If you're a converted Tartar, an Orthodox, you somehow manage to combine the two. And that sort of fluidity was something that came across. Village life, again, I tried to look for areas of contact in areas where there were not contacts. More contacts, I would say, between Tartars and ethnic Russians or Chuvash, simply because Tartars traded, moved goods around, and so there was more interaction in terms like clothing, foodstuffs, house design, stoves. Far less interaction when we're talking about German colonists on the Volga, where they seem to deliberately freeze in many ways, not only contacts, but the German language and customs. Now, that I'm talking about, of course, pre-revolutionary period. It's less easy to do that in the 20th century. So many people have written about the First World War, the Civil War, the 1930s, the Second World War, that what I try to do in this book is not to rewrite that, but to try to focus on particular elements of it on the Volga, which either make the Volga distinct or, in this particular case, ethnic groups distinct. So I'd look at the impact of the First World War, not just on supplies, which could happen anywhere, but on, say, in Kazan, what happened to people who were put under suspicion because they were Tartars. Did they sympathize with the Ottomans? Or they were Germans? Were they going to sympathize with the German forces? And the same in the Civil War, and the same in the 1930s as well. There've been a number of recent publications in Russia which are very useful in this respect, which talk about collectivization, possibly from the last point where it's possible, where people can write about their own personal experiences. It's so far after the event that it's rather a difficult source to use. But I did find one that looked at Mari. I tried to look at ones that look at what happens in misunderstandings, if you like, additional misunderstandings by the fact that commissars that were going in were quite often Russian, didn't even speak the language of the people they were trying to explain to the benefits of collectivization, the type of conflict that arose there. So that second aspect, the multi-ethnicity, the conflict or potential conflict between groups, the potential coming together as well, the coexistence is something that I look at. The third aspect I look at is expansion of the Russian state building. This is a fort, it's a replica, of course, it's in Ulyanovsk, but it gives an idea, I suppose, of the building of fortifications from the 16th, well, before the 16th century, but certainly in the Volga from the late 16th century onwards, and the fact that so many towns were founded as forts on the Volga. And indeed, pre the Russian state, Hazars, Bulgars were still controlling, fortifying their points on the Volga. The Volga in many ways is a first testing ground for some of these issues. I think it is a testing ground for dealing with large numbers of non-ethnic Russians and non-Christian Russians, different forms of organized social organization, nomadic peoples. So in that respect, 17th, 18th century is very crucial for that. I think if I summarize, perhaps rather sweepingly, the way in which the imperial state controlled the Volga and other parts of the frontier, it's by force and then what you might call by cultural assimilation. The force is the more obvious one. The fortifications, the presence of troops, eventually by the end of the 19th century, by the 19th century, quite late on, armed naval patrols up the Volga, the controlling of piracy to an extent by the 18th century, of Cossack revolt, I would say by the late 18th century, of integrating Cossacks into the imperial army, crushing opposition, that it was Tartars brutally in the second half of the 16th century, more officials from the late 18th century, the beginnings of a police force from 1782, the presence of a regular army. So there's that element, the simplest element, if you like, of a physical control. But there's also the much more subtle element of Russian presence, Russian assimilation, of building structures which were Russian to make the place look Russian. Monasteries, first example of this, I think, an extensive example of this in the second half of the 16th century. But then after the construction of forts, the construction of towns with Russian architecture, Russian symbols, with the Kremlin as the key symbol of Russian authority, with the walls around it, with the garrison in it or nearby, with the governor's house, with the Orthodox cathedral. So that these towns look like Russian towns. And indeed, you know, they do look like Russian towns, at least in the center. And then the more subtle ways of introducing social structures, of integrating Tatar elite, at least in particular, into the Russian aristocracy, law and education, which I mentioned earlier, becomes an area of conflict in the 19th century, but it's genuinely difficult, I think, for many non-ethnic Russian groups, because the advantage of learning Russian was that you could then make your way within the Russian Empire. So the extent to which you teach Russian is how many hours you teach Russian becomes a source of great controversy. Now, in the 20th century, of course, it's a rather different situation, although the Volga does play a key role, as you know, in both the Civil War and in the Second World War. When I'm looking at the Soviet system, it's difficult, well, it's impossible, in fact, just to take the Volga separately from other parts of the Soviet Union. But I try to keep the focus, to continue the focus on non-ethnic Russian groups and at looking at how relationships between the center, at least the nominal autonomous regions within the Russian Federation or the Russian Soviet Republic work. I mean, there's a degree of what might be sort of superficial autonomy in the Soviet period. There's more autonomy now, although you can raise the question of how much autonomy there genuinely is, but there's clearly more autonomy in somewhere like Tatarstan, with not only its own flag, but its own anthem, than there is in some of the other non-Russian republics within the Russian Federation. Throughout the 20th century, I tried to focus on the river. So if I just take the Battle of Stalingrad as an example, many other people have written about the Battle of Stalingrad. I have to write about the Battle of Stalingrad. I have to put it in the context of the Second World War to make it clear to the reader why it's so crucial in the outcome of the Second World War, and indeed the extent of the human tragedy of it. But I try to focus on the Volga. I try to focus on the fact that the first Germans who arrived on the Volga took photographs of it as the river which would be the edge of the Third Reich, of the key importance of not allowing them to control that western right bank of the Volga in many ways in determining the nature of the conflict. And indeed of the ideology that is there at the time with the tanks, which I've seen in parks up the Volga, which have Mother Volga written on them, clearly to use and to inspire that, you know, the Volga must not be crossed. The Volga has to be the clear indication of the barrier which you cannot cross. And then, of course, it's deliberate in the sort of iconography of the Volga memorials that you do see the Germans crossing the Volga, but as prisoners of war. So I tried to keep the focus on the river. The fourth topic I look at is the Volga in Russian culture. Now, this has been written on extensively. I would defer to Guido Hausmann if he were here, because he wrote an excellent book, German, on the culture of the Volga, on travelers, on literature and on art. I tried in the book to do two things, I think, with culture. I tried to trace the evolution of the Volga, the way that the Volga changes in terms of the way that it's perceived in Russian culture. And then I try to look less thoroughly, I have to admit, at sort of the non-Russian view of the Volga. So if I'm looking at culture chronologically, I start with odes in the 18th century. After Catherine goes to Kazan and goes down the Volga in 1767, that odes are written that not only glorify the Empress and her progress down the Volga, but go a step further and actually talk about the river being tamed by the Empress as she goes down the river. The river itself is in awe of Catherine the Great and becomes still untamed as Catherine goes down the river. Now, that period, 1767, we're still talking about the need, if you like, to tame the Volga, to tame the non-Russian towns upon the Volga. And Catherine's progress is very important in that. I am in Asia, she wrote, completely ungeographically to Voltaire as she arrived in Kazan, but she was making, again, a cultural statement, if you like. So I start with odes, and then I go through into the 19th century with the range, if you like, of views on the Volga. It's the 19th century when it becomes, as you know, that the popular Russian river, the protector of the Russian people, the special element of it is that Mother Volga is going to protect not only Russia, but its children. So it's Mother Volga. It's Father Thames, of course, as Mother Volga. It's not unique to be a parent, but it's a Mother Volga of the children. And then also the other aspects the Volga in 18th and 19th century thought the Rebel River, the links with Zenka Razin and with Pugachev as the river that can hide rebels against the state and can be a challenge to the state. And the river is also as an indication of oppression, which can be seen particularly, I think, in Nekrasov, but also in the prose of Gorky and of Chirikov. So I wouldn't present myself as a literary historian, but I present it in relationship to the river, in relationship to the way in which the rivers is seen as a different form of identity, if you like. In the 20th century, the Russianness remains, except it becomes much more for all citizens of the Soviet people. I mean, I'm sure you have seen the film Volga, Volga, the 1930s. I rather like that film. It's rather jolly. But the message is very clear in the songs and the main song of the Volga that it is the river of the Soviet people. It's the river the enemies do not dare cross, because if they were to do so, as it says, if they would leave their tracks to our country's border, they shall not see our beautiful Volga, and they won't drink from Volga's waters. And this is 1930s, so it's pre-Stalingrad. I try and do a parallel study in art. I've also already mentioned the Volga boat haulers, but of course other aspects as well. It's in the early 19th century that becomes important in Romanticism. And at first that's a source of some embarrassment, I think, to some Russian painters, until they come to grips with the Volga and they see its own particular form of beauty. And Shishkin can also compare the ruins of Volga with the sort of ruins of ancient Italy, ancient Greece. And so it brings Russia into a sort of European line in painting. I write about the sacralization of the Volga, which Guido Haussmann has written on, but I went to the source of the Volga, and it has been blessed. It is a sacred place. And then from the second half of the 19th century, I talk about tourism. It was also, of course, Tatar, Chuvash River. There's a Kalmyk River. It's a German river. I don't read Kalmyk, Chuvash, Tatar. I have to rely on English translations. Oddly enough, there are translations of Chuvash poems and translations of Tatar poetry in English. And I was able to use some of that as well to try to give an image of the Volga that wasn't purely Russian. It was a Volga for Tatars as well. And that sort of poetry, I can't say it's distinctive. It's the same sort of rather romantic, emotional poetry that you would have from Russia. Finally, if I'm looking at culture, and I am coming to an end, I think there's been quite an attempt in Russia to reinvent themselves. This is Simbirsk, this is Ulyanovsk. I went there in November of 2019, my last journey abroad before lockdown. I went there partly to see the great Lenin Memorial, and I'd read the website, which cheerfully told me it was open sort of all hours, and I got there and found that it was very, very shut. And not just the Sanitary Dien, but clearly going to be shut for several years as it was reconstructed. But it didn't really matter, because parts of Ulyanovsk are very charming. They have a lot of small little merchant houses which have been preserved, a Lenin house. And now they're reinventing themselves, or trying to reinvent themselves in terms of the writers. Goncharov came from Simbirsk, and this is really a quite delightful monument, I think, to Oblomov. It is the sofa and his slippers you can see there on the floor. Where that actually brings tourists back to Ulyanovsk, I'm not quite sure. It's a devil of a place to get to from London. You have to spend the night at Sheremetyevo Airport, and I'm getting a little bit old for that. And I can tell you that I was the only tourist I saw all day. I was the only person to enter these small museums, but it was November. It was about -8. It wasn't perhaps the best time to go. So that was my final sort of cultural element. And I'm going to conclude by looking at, I wouldn't call it a reinvention, but just quite an extraordinary building, really. This is the Sharif Mosque in Kazan, which opened in 2005. Sharif was a Muslim scholar who served in the mosque in the mid-16th century and who died along with his students defending the citadel against the forces of Ivan IV in 1552. It can hold 6,000 worshippers. It's reputed to be the largest mosque in the Russian Federation, and it's one of the largest mosques in Europe. Well, you know, Tatars are Muslim. Doesn't seem particularly surprising, except when one reflects that when Ivan the Terrible conquered Kazan in 1552, he destroyed all the mosques in the city, and one of his first acts was to lay the foundations for an Orthodox cathedral at the point where his colours had been raised above the town. And it's even more startling to me that this is in the centre of the Kremlin in Kazan. You can see the administrative buildings round the side. It's right next to the Orthodox cathedral. The Orthodox cathedral has not been pulled down, but it's higher than the Orthodox cathedral. It's bigger than the Orthodox cathedral. But when tourists come and are shown around the Kremlin, as I was on my boat trip, you're shown both. You're shown the mosque and you're shown the cathedral as if they're completely equal in status, and this is something which has always been there. But in fact, of course, the Kremlin is the absolute living manifestation of the Russian Empire, Russian Orthodox Empire. And to build this inside the Kremlin, not outside the Kremlin, is a very startling thing to do to me. And to me, it's the living symbol, if you like, of the complexity of the relationship today between Russian authority, Russian orthodoxy, and then the reassertion of a Tatar Muslim identity. And it's that uneasy balance between the two that's being played out on the River Volga. So, thank you very much.